Sophia Reynolds had always prided herself on being a sharp, authoritative presence in the airline industry. As a senior flight attendant with over a decade of experience, she had seen it all. Last-minute seat changes, entitled first-class passengers demanding absurd requests, and economy travelers trying to sneak into premium cabins they hadn't paid for. She believed herself to be an expert at reading people, a skill honed from years of managing high-stress flights and passengers of every temperament. In her mind, she could spot a fraud from a mile away. And that belief, the unwavering certainty that she could never be wrong, was exactly what would lead to her downfall. The flight had begun like any other. The doors were still open, passengers boarding in an orderly but slow procession, some struggling with overhead bins, while others settled into their seats with quiet anticipation. As Sophia moved through the first-class cabin, checking on her high-paying passengers, ensuring they were comfortable, she caught sight of a man in one of the premium seats, a black man dressed in a simple but well-pressed navy blue suit, adjusting his carry-on beneath the seat in front of him. Something about the sight nagged at her. His expression was calm, his posture relaxed, but there was an ease about him that felt off. She had seen plenty of passengers who looked out of place before. It was usually a mistake, an accidental upgrade, or a mix-up at the gate. Sophia had made it her personal mission to ensure the exclusivity of first class remained intact, that the wrong kind of people didn't disrupt the experience for those who had truly paid for luxury. It wasn't personal, she told herself. It was simply protocol. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice professional but firm as she stepped up to him. "May I see your boarding pass?" The man, Jason Carter, looked up at her, expression unreadable. He blinked once, then reached into his pocket and handed over his ticket without question. He had faced moments like these before, far too many times in his life, and he already knew how this interaction was going to go. Sophia barely glanced at the ticket before her brows knitted together. "This is for first class?" she asked, a hint of skepticism creeping into her voice. "Yes," Jason replied, his tone even. She pursed her lips. The ticket looked legitimate, but something still didn't sit right. Without thinking, she let out a small sigh that came laced with impatience. "Are you sure this wasn't issued to you by mistake?" The air in the cabin shifted. Nearby passengers, who had been quietly sipping their complimentary drinks or flipping through magazines, suddenly took notice, heads turned ever so slightly, eyes flickering toward the exchange. Some pretended not to listen, while others watched with passive curiosity. Jason exhaled slowly, his fingers curling slightly in his lap. "No mistake," he said, still calm, still steady. "I purchased it myself." Sophia hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Right," she said, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "I just need to confirm something in our system. Please step aside while I handle this." She didn't wait for his response. Instead, she motioned for him to follow her toward the galley, where she quickly picked up the in-flight phone and punched in a code. Her voice was hushed, but Jason could still hear the irritation in her tone. A few moments later, she turned back to him, flashing the same forced professional smile. "There seems to be an issue with your booking," she said, her voice artificially sweet. "We can offer you a seat in economy while we sort this out." Jason's jaw tensed slightly, but his voice remained smooth. "There is no issue," he replied. "My ticket is valid." Sophia's forced smile thinned. She had expected compliance, expected him to simply accept the downgrade and move quietly. "Sir, I don't want to repeat myself," she said, voice sharper now. "Please take your things and move to economy." The shift in the cabin was now undeniable. Passengers in first class were fully aware of what was happening, yet none of them spoke up. In economy, heads lifted as whispers spread through the rows. It was a slow-moving ripple of discomfort, a creeping tension that filled the air like an invisible storm. Jason looked at her for a long moment, reading the certainty in her face, the assumption behind her words. She had already decided he didn't belong here. It didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter what his ticket showed. Her mind was made up. Without another word, he turned, walked back to his seat, and reached for his carry-on. He pulled it from the overhead bin, slid the strap over his shoulder, and began walking down the aisle. He could feel the stares following him, some filled with curiosity, others with quiet judgment. But no one said a word. He lowered himself into an empty seat in economy and let out a slow breath. The space was tighter, the seat rougher, but it wasn't the downgrade that bothered him. It was the humiliation. His fingers hovered over his phone before he finally typed out a message. Boarded. Got moved to economy. Flight attendant refused to check my ticket properly. He hit send. A few seconds later, his phone vibrated. What do you mean they moved you? Jason's gaze flickered toward the front of the plane. Sophia Reynolds continued her duties, completely unaware of the mistake she had just made. Another message appeared. Give me the flight number. Jason typed it in. There was a long pause. Then the final message came. Sit tight. This isn't over. Jason leaned back in his cramped seat, staring out the small window. The hum of the engine filled the cabin, but his mind was elsewhere. Sophia Reynolds had made an assumption, one she didn't bother to verify, one she had acted on without hesitation. By the time she realized her mistake, it would be far too late. For years, Ava Monroe had walked through the aisles of airplanes with an air of absolute authority. She prided herself on maintaining order, on ensuring that rules were followed, and on making sure that passengers knew exactly who was in charge. To her, first class wasn't just about luxury, it was about exclusivity. It was about making sure that those who sat in these premium seats had earned their place. She never saw herself as unfair, never once considered that she might be making decisions based on anything other than protocol. She believed she was simply doing her job efficiently, strictly, and without emotion. But today, as she stood at the entrance of a small conference room deep within the airport's administrative offices, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, she finally understood. The way we treat others matters, and she had just learned that lesson the hardest way possible. She had spent the past 3 hours reliving her mistake, watching as it unfolded in whispers, stolen glances, and the judgment that had turned its sharp edge against her. The same passengers who had watched her remove Jason Carter from first class had now seen her lead him back, her voice quieter, her posture smaller. The same first-class travelers who had barely noticed her before were now fully aware that she had made a grave misjudgment, and their discomfort at her presence was palpable. The people who had once respected her authority now saw it for what it had been, a weapon she had wielded too carelessly. And now? Now she was standing in front of the people who would decide her fate, and there was no protocol, no authority, no control left for her to cling to. The door creaked open, and she was ushered inside. 3 executives sat at the long table, their faces unreadable, their hands folded neatly in front of them. The weight of their gaze felt suffocating. Ava Monroe, the woman in the center, spoke first, her voice cold, clipped. Do you understand why you're here? Ava swallowed hard. The truth clawed at her throat, but she couldn't bring herself to say it. Instead, she nodded. There was a long silence. The second executive, a tall man with sharp features, leaned forward. A misunderstanding about a passenger's status in first class. He repeated the phrase she had used earlier, the one she had clung to when she had still believed she could talk her way out of this. But now the words felt thin, hollow. Ava forced herself to speak. Yes, she said quietly. A mistake. The third executive, an older man with deep lines on his face, let out a breath that felt like it carried years of disappointment. Miss Monroe, he said, his voice almost pitying, a mistake is when you spill a drink on a passenger. A mistake is when you forget to ask someone if they'd like coffee or tea. He paused. What you did was a decision. The words slammed into her chest like a weight, a decision. She had decided in an instant that Jason Carter didn't belong in first class. She had decided without evidence that there had been an error. She had looked at him, at his presence in that luxurious seat, and she had judged him unworthy of being there. It had felt so small at the time, a simple reassignment, a necessary correction. But it hadn't been small to him. It hadn't been small to the passengers who had watched in silence, their indifference speaking louder than words. And now it wasn't small to her. The first executive slid a paper across the table. The official document shook slightly as she set it down in front of Ava. Effective immediately, the woman said, her voice unwavering. Your employment with this airline is terminated. Ava's breath caught. The words blurred for a moment, her mind refusing to process them. Fired. The word wrapped around her throat, suffocating. She had spent years believing she had control, believing that her judgment was final, believing that passengers had no choice but to accept her decisions. And yet, here she was, being dismissed without hesitation, without argument, without a second chance. The irony was bitter. She wanted to fight, wanted to plead, wanted to tell them that she had been a dedicated employee for over a decade, that she had handled thousands of flights with precision, that she had never once received a formal complaint. But she knew deep down that none of it mattered, because the way we treat others matters. And today she was being treated exactly as she had treated Jason Carter, coldly, indifferently, like a problem that needed to be removed. As she reached for the paper, her hands trembled. She had spent years making passengers feel small. Now she was the one who felt small. She was escorted out of the conference room, her footsteps echoing against the sterile floor. She passed the employees she had once commanded, the same ones who had feared her sharp reprimands, her strict adherence to rules. They didn't look at her. They didn't offer comfort. She was invisible now. As she stepped through the side exit of the airport, the warm afternoon air hit her like a slap. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts with shaky fingers. She needed to call someone. Anyone. She tried a former supervisor, voicemail. She tried an old colleague. The call went unanswered. With each attempt, reality sank deeper and deeper. She had spent years wielding authority, ensuring that she was respected. But respect, she realized too late, wasn't about fear. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about making others feel small. Respect was about how you treated people. And now the world had returned the favor. Her reputation was gone. Her career was over. And as she stood outside the airport, the very place that had once been her kingdom, she finally understood. The way we treat others matters. And in the end, it had mattered for her too. So ask yourself this: how do you treat people? Because one day you might find yourself on the other side. And when that day comes, will you be the one standing tall? Or will you be the one left with nothing? Ava Monroe had spent years building her career in the airline industry, climbing the ranks with discipline and determination. She wore her authority like a badge of honor, a shield that ensured she was respected and obeyed. As a senior flight attendant, she believed herself untouchable, someone who dictated the rules, enforced them without question, and ensured that the prestige of first class remained untainted. She had never been challenged before, never been forced to reckon with the consequences of her decisions. Until today. Today, Ava Monroe learned that power is fleeting. The first sign of her unraveling had been subtle. Just a brief flicker of discomfort in the first-class cabin, a few heads turning when she asked Jason Carter for his ticket, her tone laced with quiet skepticism. She had convinced herself that she was merely doing her job, ensuring that a mistake hadn't been made. After all, she had seen people slip into first class before, had watched them fumble when questioned. She was trained to spot the ones who didn't belong. But Jason Carter had belonged. She just hadn't given him the courtesy of believing it. And now, standing in a cold, impersonal conference room in the administrative offices of the airport, Ava was no longer in control. For the first time in her life, she was the one being judged. 3 executives sat before her, their gazes impassive, their hands folded neatly over the reports detailing what had happened. Behind them, a large window overlooked the tarmac, where airplanes taxied in the distance, passengers blissfully unaware of the reckoning happening inside this small room. Ava's palms felt clammy against the smooth wood of the table, but she kept her back straight, her expression neutral. She would not crumble, yet deep inside, fear coiled tightly around her ribs. The lead executive, a woman with short silver hair and piercing blue eyes, leaned forward slightly. "Miss Monroe," she began, her voice calm but edged with something unreadable. "Do you understand why you're here?" Ava nodded, swallowing hard. "I made an error in seating a passenger," she said carefully. The second executive, a tall man with sharp cheekbones, raised an eyebrow. "An error?" Ava hesitated. "A mistake," she corrected herself. A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The third executive, a man with a bald head and a deep crease between his brows, let out a slow breath. "Miss Monroe, let me be clear," he said. "A mistake is something that happens unintentionally. What you did was a decision. You removed a paying first-class passenger from his seat without verifying his ticket. You made an assumption. Ava's fingers tightened in her lap. I was following protocol. No, the silver-haired executive interrupted, her voice cutting through Ava's defense like a blade. Protocol would have required you to check the system first. Protocol would have required you to verify the ticket before acting. She exhaled sharply. What you followed was your own judgment, and it was wrong. The words struck Ava like a slap, but she kept her face still, her breathing steady. She wouldn't break. She couldn't. The tall executive tapped his fingers against the table. Tell me, Miss Monroe, he said, tilting his head, if Mr. Carter had been a different passenger, someone who, say, fit your expectations for first class, would you have asked for his ticket at all? Ava opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because they both knew the answer. She had never questioned the other passengers. The businessmen in their press suits, the elderly couple sipping champagne, the woman in designer sunglasses flipping through her tablet. She had moved past them all without a second glance. Only Jason Carter had been asked to prove he belonged. And that, more than anything, was why she was sitting here now, facing the consequences of her actions. The silver-haired executive slid a piece of paper toward her. Ava's stomach twisted at the sight of the company letterhead. The words printed in bold black ink. Termination of employment. Her ears buzzed. This is immediate, the woman said. You will be escorted from the premises. Your employment with this airline is officially terminated. Ava's breath caught in her throat. Wait. The bald executive shook his head. The decision is final. She had never felt so powerless in her life. Ava had spent years making decisions that affected other people, believing herself untouchable, believing that her authority would always protect her. And yet, in the span of a single flight, she had been stripped of everything. It didn't matter how long she had worked here. It didn't matter how many flights she had managed with efficiency, how many passengers she had assisted, how many promotions she had earned. Power, she realized too late, was temporary. Her chest ached as she reached for the paper, her hands shaking as she gripped it tightly. The reality was setting in. She had been fired. Not reassigned, not given a warning, fired. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She pushed back her chair, forcing herself to stand. The executive said nothing as security stepped inside, silently waiting to escort her out. Ava walked with her chin high, but each step felt heavier than the last. She had been the one to enforce the rules. She had been the one to pass judgment. And now she was the one being removed, just like she had removed Jason Carter. The irony was bitter. As she stepped through the exit doors and into the warm afternoon air, she instinctively reached for her phone. She needed to call someone, a former colleague, a friend, someone who could fix this. She scrolled through her contacts, her heart hammering. She tried one number, no answer. She tried another. Straight to voicemail, panic clawed at her chest. They knew. The industry was small and word had already spread. No one was going to save her. She had spent years using her authority to decide who belonged and who didn't. Now, for the first time in her life, she was the one who didn't belong anywhere. Her privilege had been temporary. Her power had been fleeting. And the weight of that truth was unbearable. So let this be a lesson, one she had learned too late. The way you treat people matters, because power doesn't last forever. And when it's gone, all that remains is how you made others feel. For years, Ava Monroe had walked through airport terminals with her head held high, her uniform crisp, her authority unquestioned. She had built a reputation as a strict but efficient senior flight attendant, one who didn't tolerate nonsense, one who enforced the rules with precision. She believed that she knew what was best, that her judgment was beyond reproach. But today, as she stepped through the employee exit for the last time, her world collapsed around her. The truth was undeniable now. She had been judged. Not by a single passenger, not by a supervisor handing out a slap on the wrist, but by the industry she had dedicated her life to. And the verdict had been swift and final. Ava Monroe was no longer a flight attendant. She was no longer the woman who gave orders, who commanded respect with a single look, who had the power to determine who belonged and who didn't. She was no one. As she emerged into the parking lot, the hot afternoon sun bearing down on her, she clutched the termination letter in her trembling hands. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to keep walking, each step heavier than the last. She had seen passengers fall apart before, seen their eyes go wide with disbelief when they were denied an upgrade, seen them argue, seen them break down in frustration. She had dismissed their complaints, convinced that rules were rules and that her decisions were absolute. She had never imagined that one day she would be the one left begging for a second chance. A lump formed in her throat as she reached into her bag for her phone, her fingers shaking as she scrolled through her contacts. She needed someone, anyone, who could help her fix this. Her old manager? No answer. A former coworker? Straight to voicemail. Ava's breathing hitched. Her industry had turned its back on her before she even had a chance to explain herself. She had always thought she was irreplaceable, that her years of experience, her seniority, her dedication would protect her. But power is a fragile thing, and now she had none. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. How had this happened? How had everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, been wiped away in the span of a single flight? But she knew the answer. She had made a decision. She had looked at Jason Carter and decided without checking, without verifying, without thinking yang, that he didn't belong. And the world had responded in kind. A sudden gust of wind rustled the papers in her hands, and she looked down at them, at the bold black letters of her termination notice. A decade of work reduced to a single sheet of paper, her heart pounded in her chest as she thought of all the people she had treated the same way. How many times had she dismissed a passenger, assuming they were in the wrong? How many people had she made to feel small, like they had to prove they belonged? How many had walked off her flights feeling exactly the way she felt now? Powerless, humiliated, discarded. She had never cared before, but now she understood. Her privilege had shielded her for years. She had wielded her authority like a weapon, believing she was untouchable. But the thing about power is that when you abuse it, when you use it to diminish others, when you make yourself the sole judge of who deserves respect, it will always, always come back to you. She looked up, her eyes scanning the parking lot. Across the pavement, a sleek black car was pulling away from a private terminal entrance. Daniel Cole. The man she had humiliated, the man she had dismissed, the man she had assumed didn't belong. He had left the airport with his dignity intact, his authority unchallenged, his place in the world unshaken. And she? She was standing here alone, clutching the remains of her career, searching for someone, anyone, who might be willing to give her a second chance. But no one was coming. No one was going to fix this for her, because accountability had come for her and there was no escaping it. She thought of all the passengers she had ignored when they protested, all the complaints she had brushed off with a tight smile and a dismissive nod. She had never imagined that one day she would be the one with no voice. A tear slipped down her cheek and she wiped it away quickly, gritting her teeth. No, she wouldn't cry. She wouldn't fall apart. She had built her career on confidence, on control, on never letting anyone see her falter. But what was she without that control? Without the uniform? Without the authority? Just another person left behind. The realization crushed her. She had spent her life believing that the rules didn't apply to her, that she would always have the final say. But today, she had learned the hardest truth of all. Everyone answers for their actions, even her, especially her. So now, as she stood outside the airport, her life unraveling around her, she faced a choice. She could wallow in the unfairness of it all, cling to her anger, convince herself that she had been wronged, or she could admit the truth. She had done this to herself, and maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to change. Because power isn't about control. It isn't about making others feel small. Real power is in how you treat people. And today, for the first time in her life, Ava Monroe was powerless. So let this be a lesson, one she had learned too late. The way you treat people matters, because sooner or later, accountability comes for everyone. And when it does, you won't be able to run from it. So now I ask you, the listener, what will you do when the moment comes? Will you wield your power with kindness? Will you treat others with dignity, with fairness, with respect? Or will you assume, judge, dismiss, until one day you're the one standing alone, with no one left to fight for you? If Ava Monroe's story resonates with you, if you believe in justice, in fairness, in accountability, like this post, share it, spread the message, because the way we treat people defines us. And if we don't learn that lesson now, the world will teach it to us in ways we'll never forget. For years, Ava Monroe had demanded respect. She wore her crisp uniform like armor, walked through airport terminals with authority, and enforced rules without hesitation. She expected compliance. She expected obedience. And above all, she expected respect. Not the kind that was earned through kindness, fairness, or understanding, but the kind that came with her title, her badge, her years of service. But standing outside the airport, clutching a crumpled termination letter in her trembling hands, Ava Monroe realized something she had never considered before. Respect was never something she had the right to demand. It was something she should have given, and she had failed. Her fingers curled into fists as she stared at the words printed on the page. Termination of employment. The phrase felt heavier than anything she had ever carried, heavier than any consequence she had ever doled out. Her chest burned with something sharp and unfamiliar. Regret. She had always believed she was a good flight attendant, a professional who knew how to manage passengers, maintain order, and ensure that the airline's first-class experience remained pristine. She had prided herself on her ability to command attention, to make people listen. But she had never stopped to ask herself, was that respect, or was it just fear? Because now, standing alone in the fading afternoon light, she could see it clearly. No one respected her, not really. The silence from her former colleagues, the unanswered calls, the cold efficiency with which she had been escorted from the airline's offices, it all told her exactly what she had refused to acknowledge for years. People had followed her orders because they had to, not because they respected her. And the reason why? Because she had never respected them first. Her throat tightened as she thought back to the moment it had all unraveled. The moment she had looked at Daniel Cole and assumed he didn't belong. She had questioned him not because he had done anything wrong, but because of a feeling, a gut instinct that had told her something was off. But gut instincts could be wrong, and hers had cost her everything. She could still see the look in his eyes when he had calmly, deliberately asked, "Why are you moving me now? You seem sure I didn't belong earlier." He hadn't yelled, he hadn't argued, he hadn't demanded that she be fired. And yet, here she was, because respect, true respect, wasn't about authority. It wasn't about how many years she had worked for the airline or how many flights she had supervised. It was about treating people as human beings. And Ava Monroe had failed at that. Her stomach churned as she thought back to all the times she had dismissed passengers with a tight smile, all the moments she had silenced complaints with clipper professionalism, all the times she had exercised her authority without thinking about how it made the other person feel. She had expected respect simply because of the title embroidered on her uniform. But what had she given in return? She had humiliated a man in front of an entire cabin. And now the world had humiliated her in return. A bitter wind whipped through the parking lot, rustling the papers in her hands. She looked up, her gaze settling on the distant skyline, the city where she had built her life, the life that had just crumbled beneath her. She had spent years believing she had power. But she understood now, real power wasn't in making people obey. It was in the way you made them feel. And the way she had made Daniel Cole feel, the way she had made countless other passengers feel, small, insignificant, undeserving of respect, had finally caught up to her. She let out a shaky breath, her throat tight. This wasn't just about losing her job. This was about realizing that she had built her entire career on the wrong foundation. And now she had nothing left. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and for a fleeting moment, hope surged in her chest. Maybe someone was calling back. Maybe someone was willing to help her. But as she glanced at the screen, her heart sank. It wasn't a call. It was a notification, a news article. Her name was trending. She clicked on it with numb fingers, and the headline sent ice through her veins. Senior flight attendant fired after wrongfully removing passenger from first class. What this means for airline discrimination. Below it, the video played. Someone had recorded everything. Her voice rang through the speakers, clipped and authoritative. "Sir, I need you to move to economy." And then Daniel's calm response. "I had my ticket. You saw it. The comments below the article were brutal. She got exactly what she deserved. This happens all the time. Glad someone finally got called out. Power trips like this are why people hate flying. She thought she was untouchable. Guess not. Ava's hands shook as she scrolled, her breath shallow. They were right. Every single one of them. She had thought she was untouchable. She had thought she had the right to question people without reason, to assume things without consequences. But consequences had come for her, and now she had to live with them. She took a slow, unsteady breath, staring at the sky, blinking back the stinging in her eyes. She had spent years looking down on passengers, thinking she knew better, thinking she was above them. Now she was just like them, just another person trying to figure out where to go next. And maybe, just maybe, that was the lesson she had needed to learn. She lowered her phone, her fingers trembling. For the first time in years, Ava Monroe had no authority, no control, no power. And for the first time in years, she realized how much that actually meant. She had spent so long demanding respect. But maybe if she had just given it first, she wouldn't be standing here alone. So now she faced a choice. Would she stay bitter, or would she change? Would she take this as a moment of self-pity or as a moment of self-reflection? Would she try to fight for her old life back? Or would she finally try to become the person she should have been all along? The wind whipped through the lot again, and Ava inhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her forehead. She didn't have the answer yet, but maybe for the first time she was asking the right question. And now I ask you, what do you think? Do you believe Ava can change? Should she get another chance? Or should she have to live with the consequences of her choices? Comment below. Let's talk about this. Because respect should never be demanded. It should always be given first. Ava Monroe sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop. The email was still open, its words cold and impersonal despite the weight they carried. Effective immediately, your employment with this airline has been terminated. She read it again and again. It didn't change. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. She had spent hours trying to craft the right response. But what was the point? There was no argument she could make, no excuse that would erase what had happened on that flight. No one was listening anymore. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. She had spent her entire career believing she was the one in control, that she was the one making the decisions. And yet, with a single mistake, she had been cast aside like she never mattered at all. But it wasn't just one mistake, was it? That was the thought that haunted her the most. It wasn't just about Daniel Cole, it was about all the times before. Every passenger she had dismissed, every voice she had silenced, every moment she had chosen authority over basic human decency. She had spent years seeing passengers as problems to manage, as rule breakers to correct, as inconveniences standing in the way of order. Now she was the inconvenience. A knock at the door startled her, and for a moment she considered ignoring it. But the silence in her apartment was suffocating, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stand being alone with her thoughts. Dragging herself to her feet, she crossed the small space and pulled the door open. Rachel Carter stood on the other side. Ava's stomach twisted. Rachel had been there that day. She had watched everything unfold from the galley, had questioned Ava's decision even before it became clear just how badly she had misjudged the situation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rachel let out a small sigh. I wasn't sure if you'd even open the door. Ava forced a weak smile. Yeah, well, I wasn't sure either. Rachel shifted, glancing past Ava into the dimly lit apartment. Can I come in? Ava hesitated. Part of her wanted to shut the door, to shut everything out, to pretend that none of this was happening. But the other part of her, the part that had spent the last 48 hours drowning in regret, knew she couldn't keep running. With a small nod, she stepped aside. Rachel entered, her gaze scanning the room. It was a mess. Half-packed suitcases, piles of clothes she hadn't bothered to fold, an untouched cup of coffee sitting cold on the counter. You look like hell, Rachel said, not unkindly. Ava let out a soft, humorless laugh. I feel worse. Silence stretched between them before Rachel finally spoke again. Have you talked to him? Ava swallowed hard. She didn't have to ask who Rachel meant. Daniel Cole, the man she had wronged. The man who, with a single look, had made her realize just how blind she had been. The man who had every reason to hate her. Ava shook her head. I sent an email, she admitted. But I don't think he'll read it. Rachel tilted her head. What did you say? Ava hesitated, then with a sigh, she moved to her laptop and pulled up the draft. She hadn't sent it yet, but the words had been tormenting her since she had typed them. Dear Mr. Cole, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to respond. But I need to say this anyway. I was wrong. What I did to you was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility. I assumed things about you that I had no right to assume. I treated you unfairly. I humiliated you in front of an entire plane full of people. And worst of all, I didn't even realize what I had done until it was too late. Since then, I've had time to think, and I can see now that this wasn't just about one mistake. It was about a pattern, a habit, a way of thinking that I never questioned until it cost me everything. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to say this. I am sorry. Rachel read the words carefully, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she let out a slow breath. It's honest, Ava scoffed. It's pathetic. Rachel met her gaze. No, what's pathetic is thinking you don't have anything left to learn. The words hit harder than Ava expected, because for years she had believed she already knew everything. She had believed that her way was the right way, that her judgment was flawless, that she was above mistakes. But the truth was, she had been wrong for a long time, and now she was paying for it. She turned back to the email, her finger hovering over the send button. What if it doesn't matter? She whispered. Rachel tilted her head. What do you mean? Ava swallowed, her throat tight. What if it's too late? What if he doesn't care? What if no one cares? Rachel sighed. Maybe he won't. Maybe no one will. But that's not the point, is it? Ava frowned. Rachel leaned forward. The point is, do you mean it? Do you actually want to be better? Or are you just trying to make yourself feel better? Ava's breath caught. For so long, she had been focused on saving herself, on salvaging what was left of her career, her reputation, her pride. But that wasn't what this was about anymore. This was about who she wanted to be. And she didn't want to be the person who had looked at Daniel Cole and seen nothing but an inconvenience. She didn't want to be the person who had spent years believing she was entitled to respect without ever giving it. She didn't want to end the person she had been before Barbara. Her hand tightened into a fist. Then, without another word, she hit send. The email disappeared, swallowed by the screen. Ava let out a slow, shaky breath. Rachel smiled slightly. Good. Now let's see if you mean it. Because an apology, no matter how sincere, was meaningless if it wasn't followed by change. And Ava Monroe knew that better than anyone now. So now I ask you, do you think she can change? Does she deserve another chance? Or is it too late? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about this. Because apologies are easy, but redemption, that has to be earned. Daniel Cole didn't believe in raising his voice. He never had. He had built his entire career, his entire life, on the belief that true power didn't need to be shouted, it didn't need to be forced. Real power existed in silence, in patience, in the quiet moments where justice spoke for itself. And yet, as he sat in his first-class seat, looking out at the dark expanse of sky beyond the window, he felt something simmering inside him. Not anger, not even frustration, just exhaustion. Because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him and assumed he didn't belong. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to strip him of the dignity he had spent his entire life protecting. And the worst part, it wouldn't be the last. The hum of the airplane engine filled the silence as the flight attendants moved mechanically around the cabin, pretending not to notice what had happened, pretending they hadn't just watched a man be humiliated for no reason other than someone else's assumption. The passengers who had stared when he was escorted away now kept their eyes down, their attention glued to their books, their tablets, their overpriced cocktails. Not a single one of them had spoken up, not when he was forced to move. Not when he was questioned like a criminal in front of an entire plane full of people. Not when a seat he had rightfully paid for was taken from him without hesitation. And yet, now that he had returned, now that the truth had been revealed, there was discomfort in the air. because the passengers who had watched him leave knew that they had done nothing, and now they had to sit with that knowledge. Daniel let out a slow breath and turned his gaze forward, catching sight of Ava Monroe standing stiffly in the galley. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her usually perfect posture just a little too rigid, her expression carefully blank. But he could see it, the panic underneath, the realization, the slow sinking weight of understanding. She wasn't just uncomfortable. She was afraid, because she knew she had miscalculated. She had spent years making snap judgments, assuming she could always tell who was supposed to be in first class and who wasn't. She had thought she knew who belonged, and today she had made a mistake. But Daniel wasn't interested in revenge. He didn't need to yell at her. He didn't need to demand an apology. When Amahan didn't apology, he didn't need to ruin her, because in the end, she had already done that to herself. A flight attendant being rude to a passenger was nothing new. But a flight attendant humiliating the owner of the airline she worked for? That was something else entirely. Daniel reached for the water bottle sitting on his tray table, twisting the cap open slowly, methodically. He took a sip, and then finally he turned his head and met Ava's gaze. She froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The weight of the moment stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. And then slowly Daniel raised an eyebrow. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, a shift of expression so subtle that most people wouldn't have caught it. But Ava did, because in that single look, Daniel said everything he needed to say. You did this to yourself. Ava swallowed hard, her throat visibly tightening. Her hands trembled slightly, and for the first time she looked away. Daniel let the moment hang for a second longer before turning back toward his window, allowing the silence to settle once more. He didn't need to say a word, because justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, sometimes it was letting someone sit in the discomfort of their own mistakes. Sometimes it was allowing the weight of shame to do the work for you. Ava would remember this moment for the rest of her life, not because she had been yelled at, not because she had been humiliated in return, but because she had been forced to face the truth of her own actions. Because for the first time, she wasn't the one in control, and she never would be again. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. The damage had already been done. His reputation was intact. His seat had been returned. His dignity remained untouched. But Ava? Ava had lost something far more valuable than a job title. She had lost the illusion of her own authority, and no amount of apologies would bring that back. Justice had been served, not through anger, not through force, but through patience, through dignity, through silence. Because sometimes the quietest moments held the loudest lessons. And Ava Monroe, she had just learned one she would never forget. Now I ask you, was this enough? Did Daniel handle it the right way? Or should he have fought back harder? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. Ava Monroe had always been confident in her judgment. She had worked in the airline industry for over a decade, and in that time she had developed an instinct, an ability, she believed, to spot when something was off. It wasn't personal, it was just experience, a gut feeling, a way of making quick decisions in a high-pressure environment. And that instinct had never failed her. Until it did. Until in one careless moment, she had made a mistake so costly that it shattered everything she had built. She had assumed. And that assumption had cost her not just her job, but her entire career. Ava had never imagined that she would be standing in front of the airline's disciplinary board, facing termination. That she would be escorted out of the airport, her uniform no longer a badge of authority, but a cruel reminder of what she had lost. She never thought she would hear the words, "Your employment has been terminated, effective immediately." And yet, here she was. Her hands shook as she gripped the edges of the paper in her lap, her termination notice, the official document that erased 10 years of hard work in an instant. She read the words over and over, but they didn't feel real. She wanted to scream. She wanted to beg. She wanted to turn back time. But there was no going back, because this wasn't just about one bad decision. This was about the kind of decision she had made. Ava Monroe had looked at Daniel Cole and, without hesitation, decided he didn't belong in first class. She hadn't checked the system. She hadn't verified his ticket. She had simply looked at him, and that had been enough. Enough to assume he didn't deserve the seat. Enough to assume there must have been a mistake. Enough to strip him of his dignity in front of an entire plane full of people. And worst of all, she hadn't even realized what she was doing. Because in her mind, she hadn't done anything wrong. Not at first. Even after Daniel was escorted back to first class. Even after she was ordered to personally apologize. Even after the whispers started, she still didn't get it. Not until Captain Adler's voice came through the intercom. Not until she was called into the cockpit and asked the question that changed everything. Do you know who Daniel Cole is? Her stomach had dropped. Because the way the captain had said it, the weight in his voice, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just any passenger. And when Captain Adler spoke the next words, Ava felt her world tilt beneath her feet. Daniel Cole is the owner of this airline. The words had slammed into her like a physical blow. And in that moment, she knew. Knew that she had just ruined her life. Knew that she had misjudged the one person on that plane who had the power to end her career with a single decision. And Daniel, he didn't need to say a word. He didn't need to demand that she be fired. He didn't need to humiliate her in return. He just waited and let the weight of her mistakes settle in. By the time the plane landed, the decision had already been made. She had been told to pack her things, hand in her badge, clear out her locker. She had tried to fight it. I didn't mean to, she had started, but the executive's voice had been cold, final. That's the problem, Mrs. Monroe. You didn't mean to, and yet you did. Those words echoed in her head as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the document in her hands. She had been given no severance, no chance to transfer, no probationary period. Just gone. And as she scrolled through her phone, desperately searching for someone, anyone, to help her, she realized the worst part. No one was answering. Her contacts list, once filled with co-workers, superiors, and industry professionals, was suddenly useless. Call after call went to voicemail. Text messages were left unread. She had been erased, discarded, forgotten. She tried calling an old mentor, someone she had trained under when she first started. Nothing. She tried calling her former supervisor, hoping, praying that maybe he would vouch for her. Voicemail. She tried calling one of the other flight attendants she had once considered a friend. Silence. And then she saw it, a message in one of the airline's private work group chats. She wasn't in the group anymore. She had been removed. But someone had forwarded her a screenshot, a conversation between her former colleagues. Ava Monroe's name was in bold at the top, and beneath it, she should have known better. She got what she deserved. I never liked her. She thought she was untouchable. Ava's throat tightened. Untouchable. That was the word they had used, because that's what she had believed, wasn't it? That she was above mistakes. That she was above consequences. That she could make snap judgments without ever having to face the fallout. And now here she was, alone with nothing left. Her breathing was shallow as she scrolled through the news headlines. It had already gone public. Her name wasn't in the articles, but the story was everywhere. Airline flight attendant removed after incident with CEO. Bias in the skies, a first-class mistake goes viral. She knew how this worked. Even if she managed to get another job, the whispers would follow her. Every new employer would Google her name. Every coworker would remember her as the woman who lost everything because she assumed, because she had judged, because she had let her bias dictate her actions. And now she was the one being judged. She stared at the phone in her hand, at the endless unanswered messages. She had spent years deciding who belonged. And now, she was the one who didn't. Her fingers trembled as she typed out a final message. A desperate plea to the one person she had wronged the most. To Daniel Cole. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. She stared at the screen, her chest tight, her heart pounding. Then with a deep breath, she pressed send and waited. Waited for an answer that might never come. Now I ask you, is it too late? Does Ava Monroe deserve a second chance? Or did she seal her fate the moment she decided that a man like Daniel Cole didn't belong? Drop a comment below, because this isn't just Ava's story. It's a lesson for all of us. What we assume about others can shape their future and our own. Ava Monroe had never feared consequences before. For years, she had worn her authority like armor, moving through airport terminals and first-class cabins with a confidence that came from knowing she was the one in control. She had the final say. She made the decisions, she upheld the rules, and when necessary, she enforced them without hesitation. And in all that time, she had never once considered that one day she might be the one facing judgment. That day had arrived. As she sat in the cold, sterile conference room, surrounded by airline executives who once greeted her with respect, but now only looked at her with disappointment, Ava felt something she had never felt before. Powerless. The termination letter sat on the table in front of her, the words blurred by the sting of unshed tears. She had lost everything. Her career, her reputation, her sense of identity, all because of one decision, one assumption, one mistake. The weight of it pressed down on her chest like an iron vice. Ms. Monroe, Ms. Caballero, the executive seated in the middle of the long table spoke, her voice sharp and final. Do you understand why you're here? Ava swallowed hard. She wanted to argue. She wanted to fight. She wanted to tell them that she had only been doing her job, that she hadn't meant to harm anyone, that this was all just a misunderstanding. But the truth settled in like a bitter pill, refusing to be ignored. She hadn't been doing her job. She had assumed. And now she was paying the price. Yes, Ava finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I understand. The executive nodded, her expression unreadable. Effective immediately, your employment with this airline is terminated. The finality of those words made Ava's stomach drop. She had known this was coming. But hearing it, it made it real. It made it undeniable. She had been fired, not reassigned, not suspended, not given a warning. Fired, erased, dismissed just as easily as she had dismissed Daniel Cole. As she reached for the termination letter, her fingers trembled. The once familiar logo of the airline at the top of the page now felt like a cruel taunt. She had once represented this company. Now she was nothing more than a stain on its record. A cautionary tale, a whispered warning to every flight attendant who came after her. Don't be like Ava Monroe. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound deafening in the tense silence of the room. She expected someone to say something, to offer her an ounce of sympathy, to tell her that this wasn't the end, that she could rebuild, that she could learn from this. But no one spoke, because they didn't care. They had already moved on. And now so would she. With her shoulders stiff and her jaw clenched, Ava turned and walked toward the door. Her footsteps felt heavy, the weight of her downfall pressing down with every step. As she stepped into the hallway, two security officers flanked her, silently escorting her toward the employee exit. She knew why they were there. Not because she was a threat, but because she no longer belonged. For years, she had walked through this airport with purpose, her uniform a badge of honor, her authority unquestioned. But today, she was just another former employee being escorted out like she was the problem. And maybe she was. The cold air outside hit her like a slap as the automatic doors whooshed open. She had expected it to feel freeing. Instead, it felt suffocating because she had nowhere to go. No backup plan, no safety net. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers shaking as she scrolled through her contacts. Someone, anyone. She just needed to talk to someone who still believed in her. But as she called the names of those she once considered friends, her calls went unanswered, one after another. Voicemail, blocked, ignored. Her throat tightened. The people she had worked with for years, the same people she had trained, mentored, shared shifts with, had turned their backs on her. Because no one wanted to be associated with her now. Not after what she had done. Not after how fast the story had spread. She opened her news app, already knowing what she would find. Airline flight attendant removed after incident with CEO. Discrimination in first class. Passenger claims unfair treatment. Former flight attendant speaks out. What went wrong? Her name wasn't in the articles, but everyone knew, and no airline would touch her now. Not after this. The industry was too small. Her career was over. She had made a choice, and choices have consequences. Ava sat down on a bench outside the airport, staring blankly at the pavement beneath her feet. Her whole life had been spent following rules, upholding standards, enforcing policies. And yet, in the end, she had broken the most important rule of all: treat people with respect. Now she was the one facing judgment, and there was no appeal, no second chances, no going back. For the first time in her life, she wasn't in control. She wasn't the one giving orders. She wasn't the one making decisions. She was the one being judged, and no one was coming to save her. A single thought echoed in her mind as she sat there, staring at the world that had moved on without her. She had spent years deciding who belonged, and now she belonged nowhere. Was this justice? Did Ava Monroe deserve to lose everything for one mistake? Or was this punishment too severe? If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, hit that like button. If you think Ava's story is a lesson that needs to be heard, share this video. And if you have an opinion on what happened, drop a comment below. Because this isn't just Ava's story. This is about all of us. The way we treat people matters. And in the end, consequences are inevitable. Ava Monroe had spent the last decade believing she was invincible. She had walked the aisles of airplanes, her head high, her uniform crisp, and her confidence unwavering. She had been a woman of rules, of strict policies, of unshakable authority. She had built her career on the certainty that she knew who belonged where, who deserved what, and who should be questioned. Until one day, she was the one being questioned. That day, everything changed. Losing her job had been devastating. But losing herself had been worse. For weeks after her termination, Ava struggled to make sense of what had happened. She replayed every moment in her mind, every assumption, every judgment, every decision that had led to that fateful day when she had removed Daniel Cole from first class without even checking his ticket. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of who she had become. And that realization hurt more than anything. At first, she tried to fight it. She blamed the system, the airline, even Daniel Cole himself. She told herself she had only been following protocol, that she hadn't meant to humiliate anyone. But the truth refused to be ignored. She had made a decision without facts. She had used her power instead of her judgment, and she had been wrong. But being wrong wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. For the first time in her life, Ava had to face herself, the real her. Not the flight attendant with a polished uniform, not the woman with a reputation for being tough but efficient, but the person she had become beneath all of that. And she didn't like what she saw. She had spent years judging others, but had never once stopped to judge herself. Now she had no choice. She knew that if she ever wanted to rebuild her life, she couldn't just move on. She had to change. So she did something she never thought she would do. She apologized. Not just in words, but in actions. She reached out to those she had wronged, even when they didn't answer. She wrote to Daniel Cole, not expecting forgiveness, but acknowledging her mistake. She didn't stop there. She enrolled in courses about unconscious bias, about diversity and inclusion, about fairness and leadership. She started volunteering at organizations that help disadvantaged travelers, people who had faced the very discrimination she had unknowingly participated in. At first, it was just an attempt to make things right, but somewhere along the way, something unexpected happened. She became someone new. Months passed and the world moved on, but Ava didn't. She worked, she grew, she changed, and then one day she received an email that made her heart stop. Subject: a meeting request. Daniel Cole. She hesitated before opening it. Would he tell her to stop? Would he remind her of her mistake? Would he tell her that her efforts meant nothing? But when she read his words, tears filled her eyes. Ava, I've been watching your journey. You could have walked away, but you chose to take accountability. You could have blamed the system, but you chose to change yourself. That takes strength. I believe in second chances for those who earn them. I'd like to meet. Let's talk. Daniel Cole. Ava sat frozen, staring at the screen. This was it. Not redemption, not yet, but the chance for it. Facing the past, embracing the future. The day she met Daniel Cole, she was nervous. More nervous than she had ever been. She had faced pilots, supervisors, even airline executives before, but this was different, because this time, she wasn't in control. Daniel sat across from her in a sleek, quiet office, his expression calm but unreadable. He let her speak first. And for the first time in her life, Ava Monroe didn't try to justify herself. She didn't explain. She didn't defend. She owned it. "I was wrong," she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "And I'm sorry." Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "I know." Silence filled the space between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was understanding. "I didn't call you here to punish you," Daniel said finally. "I called you here because you've proven something to me." Ava held her breath. "You learned it," he continued. "And more importantly, you changed." A lump formed in her throat. "What happens next?" she asked softly. Daniel smiled slightly. "That depends on you. A new beginning." Ava never went back to being a flight attendant, but she did return to the airline industry, not as an enforcer of rules, but as an advocate for change. With Daniel's recommendation, she was given a position in passenger relations, where she worked to improve policies on bias, discrimination, and fair treatment. She trained new flight attendants on how to handle passengers with respect, no matter who they were or where they sat. She turned her biggest mistake into her greatest lesson. And for the first time in years, she didn't just enforce fairness, she embodied it. Ava Monroe's story is more than just one woman's downfall. It's a lesson for all of us. How often do we make snap judgments? How often do we assume we know someone's worth just by looking at them? How often do we use power to dismiss others instead of lifting them up? Ava learned the hard way that titles fade. Power shifts. Authority can be lost in an instant. But character, integrity, the way we treat people, that lasts forever. So the next time you are in a position of power, whether at work, at home, or in daily life, pause. Think. Ask yourself, am I making this decision because it's right or because I can? Because the way we treat people doesn't just define them, it defines us. If you believe in second chances, hit that like button to show your support. If you think fairness and integrity matter, leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you want more powerful, life-changing stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new one. Because the world needs more stories like Ava's. Stories that remind us that no matter where we come from, no matter the mistakes we've made, we all have the power to change.